So as the South African government grapples with the challenges of declining performance in state-owned enterprises and the need to improve basic services, there is a growing recognition of the potential for increased private sector investment in the country's transport industry, specifically the railway sector. Now, while there have been previous attempts to involve private operators on some of the general freight lines, the level of success has been limited due to unattractive working conditions. Dr Mathetha Mokonyama, who is the chairman of the Southern African Transport Conference, joins me this evening to unpack these infrastructure issues, but more focusing on the solutions. Doc, a very good evening to you. As my colleague Sally alluded to earlier on, last week we focused quite a bit on Transnet and the issues that they're facing there. The problems are many. If it's not the cable theft, it's the dilapidated infrastructure, as well as the lack of maintenance and corruption, and the list goes on. But there have been some moves to change the tide somewhat, and there was the announcement by Minister Nkumbunzo Ntshavheni that there would be a transport manager or an infrastructure manager that would be launched in October this year to help ease the burden on state-owned entities like Transnet. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, good evening, Rafiwa. Yes, the President in the State of the Nation address earlier in the year indicated that there will be an infrastructure manager.
That's right.
Who will be responsible for, providing access to the private sector, but also responsible for maintaining the infrastructure. Now, that is easier said than done. It's a lot more complicated than it has been made out to be. There's a lot to sort out, and that is why we would like stakeholders to come together at the July Southern African Transport Conference to find each other so that we are on the same page. We avoid the same problems that we inherited from dismantling Transnet, formation of Metro Rail, PRASA later on, and Transnet. So there are a lot of problems that you still have inherited from the previous dismantling of the entity. So you don't want to have the same problems, into the future. So the conference that we have in July will help to the different stakeholders to find each other so that we avoid similar problems going forward.
Yeah, and so what would the mandate of this infrastructure manager be? My apologies, I said transport manager earlier on, but it's actually infrastructure manager. The mandate of that infrastructure manager, what would it be, and the role that the private sector would need to play here to ensure that that mandate is fulfilled?
Now, the reason for this infrastructure manager is to say, okay, over the recent past, freight has increased in volume, but the share on rail has been declining. The private sector is saying we want to play a meaningful role in providing services in the sector. Now, Transnet, in the recent past, has initiated this opening of the network access, given some slots to private operators. But the industry says, we don't trust you, Transnet. We don't trust that you will have the interest of the industry at heart. You will have your own interests at heart. So you need to establish an independent entity that will provide access to the infrastructure so that anyone can operate on this network. So this infrastructure manager is supposed to do exactly that, to open the network and make sure that anyone who wants to operate on the network will be provided with access. And it doesn't have to be about Transnet. It has to be for the interest of the industry. Now, what complicates matters is that this infrastructure manager will have to be appointed by Transnet. Now, that you can imagine will bring in a bit more complications because now you have to separate this essentially conflict of interest between that infrastructure manager and Transnet. So that has to be sorted out. But if it works out, then the infrastructure manager would be able to make sure that the network works as it should. It invests in the technology that is required in order to create efficiencies in the network.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring up the appointment of that manager, Doc, because Transnet actually denied the likes of Kumba Iron Ore, which wanted to take over the iron ore line so that it could export or transport its minerals for export. And Transnet actually said no to the likes of Kumba Iron Ore, who were willing to take on the maintenance of that particular line. So one is concerned then that the plan for the infrastructure manager, and as you've aptly described the work that they will need to be doing and the unlocking of the opportunities for private stakeholders to participate, it might be limited given that they will be hired by Transnet, and ultimately it sounds like Transnet will still have the final say. So that independence could be a little bit of a concern.
Absolutely. So it's one of the concerns that we're saying we need to iron out at the conference in July. So the independence. In fact, globally, it has been shown that by opening the market, you're not necessarily going to grow the services. Often, what happens is that the incumbent will lose, market share to the private operators. So you've got to put in controls to make sure that this infrastructure manager is indeed independent. And the private sector can certainly play a very meaningful role in the network, in the operations, if the infrastructure manager, as envisaged, does what they're supposed to be doing. You'd have seen, for example, Transnet capital investment has been dropping, over the years. Their performance has also been dropping, despite the growth in demand, freight growth. So the issue is not just about the infrastructure, but also about the management. So the infrastructure manager needs to make sure that they open the network to whoever wants to operate, without looking at whether it's Transnet or somebody else. But then there's another thing that needs to be overcome. I mean, getting into the industry is not cheap. So you've got to incentivize or at least meet new entrants, some halfway, let's say. So the state needs to commit to investing in infrastructure, be it rolling stock, so that the operators do not have these, barriers, entry barriers. Transnet has, for example, been borrowing quite a bit of money over the recent past. So you want to make sure that that money goes into creating or procuring the right kind of technology infrastructure, so that whoever comes in will be able to operate as they should.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Mathetha Mokonyama, joining us this evening to speak about the railway network and, of course, the solutions via the infrastructure manager that will be appointed in October. Thank you very much for your time this evening.